This to me is very, very disturbing. You see it almost everywhere now. And to me, sexuality is one of those things that grounds you in reality. In fact, it's probably the thing that grounds you in reality. So I find that whole agenda very, very, don't take me wrong here. I'm not against gay people or transgendered people or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that this linguistic agenda of theirs is ultimately going to hurt everybody, no matter where you fall on the sexual spectrum. That's my point. It's a linguistic agenda. It's a creation of a kind of virtual reality that benefits no one in the long run.
Yeah, man. Well said. And that high-octane speculation, that kind of stuff, that is the sweet spot for me. It's a bit over
my head at times, but so interesting, and I like the way you break that stuff down. So I wanted to get into your other book that came out this year, but before we close out on the education topic, what sort of advice would you have for teachers or even parents who are being made aware of these problems and need some better options for their kids?
Well, the first thing I would advise is we are to the point, I think, socially and culturally and as a civilization, where we are just going to have to stand up and say no. We're fast approaching the time that we are going to have to make some very hefty decisions on what we're willing to die for. And I'm putting it that bluntly because I believe the crisis is fast approaching that state of profundity. But the other thing I think that once you've made that determination that you're just going to stand up and say no to all of this, that the next thing you have to do is start to organize how can we resist all of this in a way that is, so to speak, particularly in this country, constitutionally approved. And the way I would suggest is that individual states now need to appoint special attorneys, prosecutors, or whatever you wish to call them, that will, on the basis of 10th and 14th Amendment, and so on and so forth, assert the right of state sovereignty against federal mandates. Whatever federal mandates may come down in all of these, huge omnibus bills that nobody in Congress reads, these have to be challenged all the way up to the Supreme Court. Just tie them up in litigation. We saw something of that effort with Obamacare, but as far as I'm concerned, they rolled over way too early with that. They should keep harping on that, but every other federal mandate, the forced vaccinations, Common Core, everything that is tied to a federal mandate of how states must spend their money should now be tied up in litigation. Absolutely. That to me is the most practical way in the short term that I think that we can respond to some of this stuff and start fighting this trend towards massive global centralization, which, as we can see, isn't working anywhere. It's not working in Europe. It's not working here. It didn't work in Russia. The Russians learned that lesson. So, they're the ones crying the loudest lately about this trend towards Mr. Global and letting multinational corporations run everything. Over and over, you're hearing from Russia that no, the sovereign nation is not obsolete. Thank you very much, Mr. Rockefeller and Mr. Brzezinski. And by golly, we're going to stick to it, and we're going to defend our country, and we're going to defend our culture. And incidentally, isn't it interesting that Russia is playing host to this year's International Homeschooling Conference? Russia. Now, turn the clock back 30 years, folks, and ask yourself if that would have been possible in Brezhnev's or Chernyenko's or Andropov's or even Mr. Gorbachev's Russia. No, certainly not. So in other words, it's like we're in this upside-down world here. The United States is looking progressively more and more like the United Socialist States of America, the USSA, and Russia, they even proudly display the Romanov eagle on their flags half the time. Russia is embarked on this weird new experiment in
culture and nationhood, a kind of postmodern experiment, as I like to call it. So, we're just looking at this huge inversion that's taken place.
Yeah, you're right. It does seem quite backwards. I mean, the whole schooling system does, and it seems like we're going to have to resort to handing out those secret passwords to the underground educational speakeasies before too long.
Well, yes, I definitely think, Greg, that's coming.
Oh, no.
Already homeschooling has grown in this country enormously in the past few years. I think what's going to happen eventually is that those teachers in the pub, I met a teacher just 3 weeks ago, Greg, that told me that she quit teaching because she just could not stand Common Core, because she had to conform to a lesson plan schedule that she hadn't even made for her own students. Now, tell me that you can centralize things to that point. So what happens is you're driving out the good teachers from the education system, and trust me, eventually the people that can afford it are going to start picking up those teachers, and you're going to see a collapse of the system simply due to market pressures. Mm-hmm. Because this system that we have now, that we've erected since, the turn of the late 19th century, this system isn't working. It's producing a bumper crop of stupid people who are more focused on the latest football game than they are on the Constitution or on physics or mathematics or literature or music or whatever. And by music, incidentally, folks, I don't mean the latest band. I mean something going back a couple hundred years.
Right.
So, we have a bumper crop of idiots in this country, and more, I think the people that have the money recognize this. And they're simply pulling their kids out of this public education nightmare. And again, that comes down to just saying no.
Amen. You said it, man. So to segue over into hidden finance, rogue networks, and secret sorcery, the fascist international 9/11 and penetrated operations, I have to say that doing a show like this over the years, I've gotten a little bit of 9/11 fatigue, whether by accident or design, or a little bit of both.
It's kind of like Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump fatigue, I know.
Oh, yeah, touche. And, after having Dr. Judy Wood here and making her case for exotic energy weapons being used on the Twin Towers, I kind of expected to close the books on it for a while, but you dig up some really interesting stuff in your investigation. It's got to be talked about, and it can be complex, but just give us a little overview of the Joseph Farrell approach to the 9/11 events.
Well, my approach is essentially similar to other 9/11 truth researchers, but my conclusions are very, very different. Mm-hmm. In any criminal investigation, particularly where murder is involved, you want to know what the murder weapon is.
Right.
And in the case of the Twin Towers, if you look at the 9/11 truth community, there has been literally an inability of people to talk to each other civilly. You mentioned Dr. Judy Wood. Well, there are some people out there in the 9/11 truth community that absolutely hate her.
True.
For proposing the idea.
Right. We should be on the same side.
Yeah. And how she manages to keep her head and to remain courteous to these people, I just don't know. But they've come up with some of the most ludicrous criticisms of her. I read one guy proposing the model of mini nukes as the mechanism for the destruction of the Twin Towers, just absolutely raking her over the coals because she didn't provide a model for how she thought this exotic energy weaponry would work. Well, my question back to him is, explain to me how a mini nuke works. What's the critical mass? What's the nuclear fuel? What's the neutron cross section? What's the half-life? And so on and so forth. And they'd never do this. So, it's tit for tat as far as I'm concerned. What she's trying to do is simply propose a model that she thinks makes sense of certain amounts of the evidence. And the same with the mini-nuke people, and the same with controlled demolition people, and so on and so forth. My approach to the question of the murder weapon is that why must we conclude when we have evidence for all of these models, and all of these models have certain problems also. All right. So my approach is it's kind of like the old Agatha Christie novel, Murder on the Orient Express. You know, they made a movie out of this with Peter Ustinov. And at the end of the movie, you know, like all Agatha Christie books, the detective, in this case Hercule Poirot, gets everybody together in a room and gives the solution. You know, wraps it all up in a neat, tidy package with a bow on it. Well, in the case of Murder on the Orient Express, what you had was a case of everybody murdering the victim, but using a different way to do it. So, in other words, this to me describes the 9/11 truth community perfectly, because they've all assumed that there's only one level of deeper player involved in 9/11, and therefore the murder weapon must reflect that player.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm suggesting is that even at the deep level of the operation, that you might have been dealing with a penetrated operation, and that there might be even deeper levels than a second level rogue network operating inside the American government. And how would they signal their presence? Well, if they penetrated an operation in which they knew that some of the mechanisms to take down the Twin Towers would be either controlled demolitions or nanothermite or mini nukes, you know, the three standard ones that most 9/11 truthers accept. Well, how would you signal your presence to that group and pin it to its own plan, like a chess pin? Well, you do so by using a technology that signaled to that group that planned and orchestrated the event, that signaled to them that they were facing another player that had just revealed itself. Okay, and this is what I think actually happens. You do have, I think, enough signatures of some sort of exotic technology there at 9/11 that fall outside the three standard mechanisms of controlled demolitions, be it standard explosives, nanothermite, or mini nukes. I do think that Dr. Wood is absolutely correct on this. So the real question is, what does that signify in terms of the perpetrators? Well, to me, it signifies that you're dealing with three levels, not two. You're dealing with the patsies, you know, the people flying the airplanes into the buildings. At a deeper level, you're dealing with a rogue network within the American intelligence community that had the capacity to plan the event and to plant controlled demolitions, or had access to mini nukes or nanothermite and so on and so forth. And what's their goal? Well, their goal is to do exactly what happened, to inject American power into the Middle East. And this is what they did. But the problem there is, as I've always thought, Greg, is you wouldn't have needed to destroy those buildings. You would only have needed to severely damage them in order to create enough of a climate of opinion to inject American power in that way. It's when the buildings come down with whatever exotic technology that brings them down that you're dealing with a penetrated operation. And particularly, I think, if Dr. Wood is correct, and I happen to think she is, I've adhered to the exotic weaponry hypothesis myself since 9/11 happened. I watched it happen. So that was my first thought when I saw what happened. So, she's not alone. She certainly is kind of out there alone on her own trying to defend the hypothesis, but she's certainly not the only one that advocated it. There was another gentleman that did so years before she published her book. And then he later retracted it. But, I review what he said in my book very carefully. So I'm looking at a Hercule Poirot, Agatha Christie, Murder on the Orient Express type of thing, where everybody, everybody essentially is in on the movie, but they're in on the murder, I should say, but using a different murder weapon.
Yeah. Oh, man. I really find this penetration pretty exciting. I guess like most penetrations. But, to break down the three levels, you say level 1 we have the patsies, the hijackers, the official narrative. Level 2 we have the planners from within the American
military apparatus. There's
Right.
got to be some. And then thirdly, this fascist international
Right.
group who seemed to flip the script on the other two
Right.
at some point.
That is the best and most succinct summary of the position I take. And the reason, and the people are going to think, fascists. They're going to think, what in the name of sense is he talking about? Well, in researching the 9/11 phenomenon, I noticed something that, again, just mystifies me that the 9/11 truth community researchers don't pursue. I found this in doing the JFK book.
Right.
Whenever they're confronted with a mysterious fascist connection, what do? They don't investigate. So let's look at what that connection is. And most people, when I found this, Greg, my jaw, I literally was sitting here in my place, no one else is in the room, and I just said out loud, "You're kidding me." And I dug a little deeper, and I thought, again, you've got to be kidding me, So I'm just putting out there what I've found, all right? Let's begin with what happens after 9/11 when the 9/11 truth community goes into full skepticism mode of the official narrative. One of the first things that they find, a fellow by the name of Douglas Hofziger did a book called Terrorland, all right? It's all about the flight school that Mohammed Atta and some of his cohorts attended in Venice, Florida, all right?
Okay.
And he found, first of all, a quotation by the then British Prime Minister Tony Blair, where Blair said that Al-Qaeda is nothing but a global network, okay? Now, global network implies something right off the bat. Number one, financing. Number two, organization. And number three, deep, deep connections.
Right.
So who could that be? Now, when he says network, he could have said power, but he doesn't say anything to indicate that it's a particular nation involved, be it Saudis, the Israelis, the Russians, the United States, nobody. He just says network. So I dig a little further, and I find an interesting quotation by a Russian economist by the name of Dr. Tatiana Koryagina that appeared in Pravda. Jim Mars dug this one up. And she stated, and this was approximately, I think, a couple of months before 9/11, and again, my memory is a little foggy. It may have been a couple months after, but in any case, within the week, she says that the United States is going to be attacked on its own soil in a kind of fake terrorist attack, but really it's coming from a small group of very powerful people, a network, she calls it, which has in excess of $30 trillion at its disposal to recreate the world the way they want.
Pretty on the nose.
Yeah, pretty on the nose. I'm thinking, okay, here we have Tony Blair says it's a network, and we have a Russian economist writing in Pravda that says it's a network. Okay? It's not a country. So in other words, we're dealing there, right off the bat, with a kind of prima facie indication that there's a third level to this thing that exceeds any particular nation-state player, including rogue groups within American intelligence. Now, they can certainly be connected to that third network. We're going to get to that. So I'm reading Daniel Hofziger's book called Murder in Terrorland or something. I forget the exact title of the book right off the top of my head. Excellent book. Hofziger goes down and he investigates the flight school in Venice, Florida. And he investigates none other than Mohammed Atta. Okay? And he points out something that floored me. He points out that most of Mohammed Atta's friends that would come to visit him weren't Arabs. They were people with names like Jürgen, Hans, Wolfgang, and so on. So, my suspicion needle immediately begins to creep into the yellow zone. So I do a little more digging, and you discover that Mohammed Atta comes to this country from, guess where? He comes to this country from Hamburg, Germany, where he had been living.
A Dreamland archive going back to 2004.
unscrambled oats. Could be the perfect food for vegetarians or those looking to cut their meat consumption.
There's nothing bad
This is the captain. Brace for impact. Is anyone still here? Come forward!
If you're like me and you have children with very unique names, you often have a really hard time finding
people think she was killed. It's just royalists in England who think it's a ridiculous idea that she'd be killed. But I think she was murdered. Quite why, I'm not entirely sure. I've heard lots of different theories, but I'm not sure why. But yeah, I think she was assassinated.
Yes, that's really sad. And being that you've been so many different places, what is your favorite food in all the different, since you've obviously tried so many, what is your favorite?
Well, it's no accident I'm in Thailand at the moment, because food, does play a big part in places I go. I do try food, and Thailand has got amongst the most amazing food. Part of the reason I'm here is to get healthy, and so easy in Thailand because the food is just delicious. They use a lot of natural foods, vegetables, coconuts. I love coconut water, drinking coconut water. It's one of the healthiest drinks you can have, and you can get it here so cheaply, So I would say Thailand for food, but when I say that, if you compare it to other countries as well, like Mexico or Italy, there's lots of food around the world. Kazakhstan, I used to live in Kazakhstan, and they have the best shashlik I've ever tried, and there's brilliant food everywhere, really. But Thailand in particular, if I had to choose, I would say the food here is pretty good.
I love that peanut butter chicken stuff that they have. Oh my God, that's good.
Yeah. Amongst other things, that's good. I like chicken with cashew nuts. And a lot of people think the food here is spicy, and certainly some of it is, but only if you want it to be. I mean, you can have much milder stuff as well.
Get a little bit more into your program. What does Truth Sentinel actually mean?
Okay, so I kind of looked at it as like, sentinel is a guard, is a sort of synonym of guard, and it's sort of like, I've got the symbol of the satellite looking down on Earth, and as a kind of sentinel looking at, trying to get the overall picture of what's happening in the news. As I'm sure you know, and some of your listeners, or many of your listeners, the mainstream media is kind of a sanitized version of the news, and to get any kind of perspective on the news, you need to listen to different types of news. So news from around the world, really, and try and piece it together. I think it's very difficult to find the truth, but on the program I try to ask a lot of questions, and I can't always give the answers, but I know sometimes I know what's not true, and I know that there's things that we're being told that aren't true, and I'm just trying to find the truth, but it is very difficult. Basically, I used to go to different countries and see places of interest that interested me, like the Mayan temples in Guatemala, and going to places like Hiroshima in Japan, and speaking to survivors there, and going to the pyramids, and going to see biblical sites.
Israel is so controversial.
Yeah, I was quite surprised when I went there. I mean, I knew there was obviously problems there, but when you go there, there's guards everywhere, and I was trying to go and see some of the mosques and things, and they would only let Muslims go into some areas, and but I did find Jerusalem just one of the most interesting places I've been, I think.
Interesting that there's so much centered around that area. Do you believe in the end of days at all?
In some ways, I want to believe in the end of days, because I think sometimes life gets a bit boring. And I know it's a bit selfish for me to want the entire universe to end just for a bit of amusement. But I think possibly we are, and I think either from a kind of religious standpoint, we could be in the end times, or even just I think the fact that humankind has the ability to exterminate each other, I think it's inevitable that that's going to happen as well. So I think yeah, we are.
And on your program, has there been a favorite guest that you've talked to?
Difficult one, really. I kind of enjoy speaking to all the guests. I think I've got a guest coming up, which might be my favorite, turn out to be my favorite guest, just because it's someone who, from an early age, I've been really, really interested in, and that's, I don't know if you've ever read the book The Dice Man by Luke Reinhardt. Have you?
No.
Okay, I recommend it anyway. It's a book about a guy who throws a dice to decide on everything he does and everything he says. And it kind of it was an international bestseller, and it kind of sparked off schools of philosophy and people deciding to lead more random lives and to try and lead their lives by rolling dices to decide everything they do. And if you try it just for a weekend, you'll have some really interesting times. You have to give yourself sort of 6 options and make at least at least 3 of them really far out of your comfort zone. And he wrote this book in the 70s, and I read it, and I used to lead quite a random life anyway, but it kind of really appealed to me. And I'm going to be interviewing him in a couple of months. So I think he may be he may turn out to be one of my favourite guests, but I've enjoyed speaking to all the guests. Like, everyone's got something to offer, you know.
Do you usually use Skype, or do you ever do an in-person interview?
I've only done one in-person interview, and that was with David Shaler, the MI5, ex-MI5 guy, who I went to meet. That was very interesting, actually. He lived in a kind of abandoned caravan on a public walkway where people were walking their dogs. It was kind of quite weird, but that was the only face-to-face one. The rest have all been Skype, yeah.
Have you ever, well, I suppose, of course you have, but on our show, we get a lot of positive feedback, but occasionally we get the occasional bad apple or bad egg. Do you ever get any really annoying criticism?
Yeah, you know, sometimes in the comments you get some people, although I find that I tend to look at them as that they've got the problem, really. They're the ones with the issues, like, I've been accused of being a MI5 operative or being a disinfo agent or the usual kind of rubbish. What sometimes I actually pretend.
Yes. What was the first thing you said they accused you of?
Being a MI5 operative.
Oh, wow.
Just because I went to Egypt and Israel, actually it's not that difficult. You can just buy a ticket, because I was in Ukraine and places like that. It's like, you can just buy a ticket to go to these places, and it's not even that expensive. I literally live hand to mouth, pay for all these tickets out of my own money. And traveling from somewhere like Egypt to Israel, for example, is you can get tickets for like $100. So it sounds glamorous, but it's not as expensive as people might think.
Is it dangerous in those areas?
Sometimes, but I mean, I guess one of the more dangerous times was in Ukraine when I was in Odessa, and it was really kicking off there. There was people shooting in the streets and bombs going off near where I was staying. So that was kind of dangerous. You
were in the middle of a war zone.
Well, it was only one day in Odessa where things got quite dangerous. Most of the problems are in the east of Ukraine, and I wouldn't go there, to be honest. I wouldn't risk it. But other times, I guess, in Thailand, I actually arrived in Thailand just before the tsunami, which killed over 230,000 people. I arrived 5 hours before that, and so that was dangerous. But at the same time, I slept through most of it. I was sort of a couple of floors up in a hotel, so I was okay. People always warn me about traveling to certain countries like Ukraine and Brazil and places like that. But I would honestly say I find London more dangerous than most of the places I go to.
Interesting.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't walk across a park late at night in London. You're more likely to be in danger than you are, say, walking at night in Ukraine, for example.
You might find Lee Murray out there, Daniel. Yeah, I don't think Scott knows who that is, but
I don't know. Who's that?
He was a mixed martial artist who went to prison for a very long time for a heist.
Okay. Yeah, I heard you guys were into martial arts. I'm actually training with Thai boxers over here in Koh Samui.
Nice.
Oh, I was thinking about asking you about that, but that's wonderful news. So you're actually doing some Muay Thai training. Fascinating.
Yeah. I'm training 5 days a week at the moment. Decided to try and get as fit as I possibly can. So for the last 2.5 months, I've been going 5 days a week, training 2 hours a day. And it's one of the best ways, fastest ways of getting fit. Those guys really push you, yeah.
Yeah, and it's not a boring way either. It's a very fun way to get in shape and exercise, because most of the time it gets very boring doing the same routine over and over, lifting weights, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, sometimes the routine is the same here, but I never get bored. It's a great way of getting rid of stress as well. There's nothing better than just hitting something really hard to get rid of stress.
Do you get really sore shins?
I get sore everything, to be honest. Even today I'm quite sore, especially if you do it each day. I'm not used to doing something day after day, but you get the weekends to recover. You get sore, but then if you get some of that Thai oil, you rub it on your muscles and it kind of warms them up and gets you ready for the next time.
Good self-defense, too, in case you ever walk in one of those London back alleys.
Exactly. I'm ready to walk across a London Park when I get back, and if anyone attacked me...
Yeah, you're ready to go.
Yeah, exactly. Although I am slightly worried that I'll get really good at Thai boxing and then I'll leave it for like 6 months and then someone will attack me and I'll have forgotten everything.
Yeah, that tends to happen. You gotta actually keep practicing these sort of things. And I think we have a caller right now. Hold on 1 second. Let me answer this. Caller, you are on the air. What's going on?
Hi, Mike. Hi, Dan. Hi, Scott.
Hello.
Scott, what is your most memorable travel where you stayed, maybe you camped out or stayed with a group of people? What stands out in your mind the most? What was your favorite? Something that you just really loved?
It's difficult to choose one, but there's definitely a couple. Many years ago, I went to Fiji when it was less touristy, and I stayed on an island and met the village chief and sat down with the local elders, and we drank this drink called kava, which is like an anesthetic, and it kind of numbs your brain. And I just remember sitting there and smiling, and everyone in the room was smiling, but nobody said anything. And it was kind of a very peaceful, nice experience. And they were so happy, and they had nothing. They lived in like mud huts, but they lived on a beautiful island, and there was no tourists there or anything. I'm sure it's changed now, but that was a great experience for me. And it taught me that, all these possessions that we have, back in the West, it really counts for nothing. And in some ways, it seems to make people unhappy. These guys were so happy. They had literally nothing, but they seemed to be able to entertain themselves with things around them. And that taught me a lot. But on a bit of a darker level, I went to Hiroshima in Japan, and I met an old lady who was a survivor of the bomb, and talking to her really had a big impact on me.
Yeah, that sounds awful.
Yeah, she was just talking about when she was only like 8 years old, and she was telling me about what happened, and it really made me think, these weapons, they just need to be got rid of for sure. Just get rid of them. They should never be used again.
Back to your experience with the village, they probably don't have the high blood pressure brought on by, I can't afford the mortgage payment this year, or crap like that. And that's, I think, that kind of, I wouldn't even call it poverty. They're probably richer in the human spirit than most people are in first world nations.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we live in a society where we've got pressures all the time to cover our food, to cover our accommodation, even water these days you have to buy. Here in Thailand, you have to buy it. You can't drink it from the taps. And we've all got all these pressures that if we get down to nothing, got no money, you can't live, you can't survive. Whereas those guys, they've got their mud huts, they've got everything they need around them to eat with. The pressure is gone, they don't need to necessarily work too much, apart from to maybe go out hunting or catch some fish.
They probably barter for the things that they don't have that much of, or maybe someone grows more in their garden, say, than another person does something else, does fishing, and they barter.
Yeah, I think they do. Maybe that was a better way of living. Things have become a bit more complicated, I think, for us.
Yeah, I think that's kind of planned that way, but that's for another time and another show. That's kind of conspiracy theory-ish, but anyway, it sounds exciting, and on a shoestring budget, that way you met the real people.
Yeah, I mean, I try and find the good in everyone, really. I mean, even people you might not think, are real people, they've all got something to offer, but people with less seem to have a bit more in their personality anyway.
Much of a better appreciation.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and an appreciation and an ability to empathise with other people, and going back to the royals, that's why they're so disconnected from